Hello, this is Justice Pivotot giving my graduate presentation for Dr. Hoke's environmental toxicology class. And this paper is over pesticide drift and livestock health. If you don't know what pesticide drift is, it's basically pesticides getting where they're not supposed to be. And then I focus on particular pesticide. Okay, so livestock, such as cattle, are important agricultural animals kept throughout the world for their meat and dairy products. Often, pesticide drift can find its way into their drinking water, soil, sediment, and even the groundwater. So, pesticides include insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, rodenticides, molluscicides, nematicides, biocides, and then plant growth regulators and other chemicals. So these can have deleterious effects on the health of livestock and indirectly impact human health, along with hurting the wider ecosystem by harming other organisms and causing an imbalance in the ecosystem like we learned in lab. Ponds can even become toxic if the ecology is out of balance with like zooplankton, phytoplankton, that kind of thing, and that can be affected by pesticides. So um, they can also be harmful and even deadly, especially if the amount of collective pesticide drift is large. So say there's farms that surround maybe this one marshland, and all these farms, the pesticide flows into it. It can become very concentrated, and it can become toxic. So another concern is that multiple pesticides acting on a non-target organism can have an additive or even a synergistic effect. So synergistic effect, like we learned in class, is almost like multiplying the effects. So could be deadly in the worst possible circumstance. So the accumulation of these toxins in the meat and milk products of livestock are significant problems in some countries, mostly developing countries. But isn't just milk and meat that can be affected, but also eggs from fowl, and especially farm-raised fish are vulnerable to this. Affected livestock are numerous, but most studies focus on cattle, swine, fowl such as chicken, and sheep. So how does pesticide drift happen? Pesticides can enter soil and water through two main processes. That would be endodrift and exodrift. So endodrift is when the active ingredient of a pesticide reaches the target area but not the biological target. So for example, if a pesticide washed off of some plant foliage but didn't get to the target area. Exodrift is when the pesticide itself is transported away from the target area, usually by drainage and surface runoff. Other factors are biocides, which are just pesticides used in gardens, lawns, and even on pets. Those can reach the soil and aquatic environments by sewage lines and runoff, or even if you put tick medicine on your dog and he runs into a pond, or that can have the same effect. So the big questions in the current literature, and mostly what I'll be focusing on in this presentation, are as follows. To what extent does pesticide that finds its way into soil and drinking water negatively affect the health of livestock? And we're going to be focusing on aquatic exodrift, so runoff and that kind of thing, rainwater and water flow, and mostly oral intake, and then again it's mostly livestock and their drinking water, which includes groundwater in some cases. And does this accumulation, does the accumulation of these chemicals in animal products negatively affect human health? So, what pesticides? There's loads of pesticides used worldwide, and as we discussed earlier, the word pesticide can mean a lot of different things. So, and another side note, a lot of pesticides have been made illegal in developed countries, but are still commonly used in developing countries. And a lot of these have been banned for a reason. They cause horrible health effects. And so in a lot of developing countries, this is actually kind of a big problem. So specific toxins include the insecticides dieldrin, which is derived from aldrin, and there's a whole class called pyrethroid insecticides, which include resmethrin, permethrin, deltamethrin, and cypermethrin. Um, Dieldrin, which mentioned earlier, is banned in most of the world for its numerous health problems that it can cause, but it can be used with some exceptions in several countries, including Argentina, where the first study we're going to look at found traces of dieldrin in cattle. So the next is diazinon, which is another harmful pesticide that was outlawed in the United States relatively recently in 2004, but it's still used in some countries such as Sri Lanka. Imidacloprid-containing products are commonly used to combat insects. It's a very common chemical, and it's in bold because we're going to talk about it a little bit later. This is one that really interested me. The mechanism is pretty interesting, and it's very widely used despite some pretty nasty health effects that it can cause. Tibuconazole is a commonly used fungicide, but is a potential carcinogen according to the EPA. And then there's DDT, DDD, DDE, the classics. I'm sure y'all have learned about that in a lot of your other classes. We talked about it in this course earlier. Particularly nasty, especially for birds. Pretty shocked it's still used in some parts of the world, but it is. So next I'm going to go into some general issues in the field, general techniques, and I'm going to be doing that by presenting some recent articles and how they did things, what they found, and that sort of thing. So the first one we're going to cover is Dubney et al. From 2018. So this paper used the ESEPA methodology to assess chronic risks for calves and adult cows from exposure to pesticides through oral intake of contaminated surface and groundwaters in Tres Arroyos County in Argentina. So the USEPA method hasn't really been used in cattle before, so that was a pretty unique approach that they used. The team found that the pesticides of interest, which were dieldrin, which we've mentioned earlier, and deltamethrin, which we also mentioned earlier, were not found in levels that would adversely affect the cattle. It should be noted, though, that since there's not much research over pesticide toxicity thresholds in cattle, the researchers used data found in similar species and extrapolated that data to fit this experiment. So, the results might not be 100%, but yeah, here is a image from that experiment. I think this is actually a picture from where they did it, so that's pretty neat. But yeah, this is a common methodology to measure the levels in the water and compare it to already known threshold levels. And the next paper did something relatively similar, also in Argentina. So this paper is relatively similar in that it's measuring pesticide levels in water and nearby soils. It's also in Argentina, so that's kind of fun. Perez et al. Very recent this year, so pretty cool. So these researchers aimed to assess the levels of 30 different pesticides that are used currently in the country in the surface water and soil in mixed use agricultural land, just like the last paper. So land that's adjacent to other agriculture, so like maybe a cornfield next to a cattle ranch, that sort of thing. So atrazine, acetylchlor, imidacloprid, and glyphosate are all illegal in many parts of the world. Like it's illegal in most of Europe, but they are legal in Argentina and some other parts of the world. So this paper mainly detected herbicides and the insecticide imidacloprid, and they determined that toxic levels of AMPA and imidacloprid residues were present, and it posed a high chronic use risk. So, as we've discussed in class, not acute, so it's not going to kill them right away, but over a long amount of time, the amount that was present could pose a risk. So that was another paper measuring the amounts in streams and nearby soils. Now we're going to go on to one that focuses more on the physiological. So this one was very interesting. So yeah, this picture actually to the right is from a completely different research article, but it's kind of similar, so I put it up there just to give you all a visual. So Hamamoto et al. From 2017, they developed a technique to measure pesticide levels in animal tissue, and this is kind of an untapped area of research. So this was pretty exciting. So techniques to measure pesticide levels in plants have been around for a while, but research into detecting level of pesticide contamination in animal tissue pretty sparse. So the team used LC-MS/MS multi-residue method coupled with modified quenchers extraction to look at levels of 8 different pesticides. And results showed that the LC-MS/MS multi-residue method is suitable for analyzing 7 of these pesticides in animal tissues, but not accurate to assess citromazine in all animal tissues or resmethrin in specifically swine liver tissue. But for everything else, it was pretty effective. So we can actually use this technique in the future to check animal tissues for pesticides. So that's pretty exciting. Nastăsescu et al. 2020, paper from last year coming out of Romania. They analyzed dairy products on cow farms in 3 different areas in Romania. They analyzed heavy metal and pesticide content and its effects on human health in the area. So it was found that DDT levels were below maximum residue levels, MRLs, in the soil in the areas. The MRL is like the highest legal amount that is tolerated, but that still doesn't mean any amount is good necessarily. MRLs are kind of determined through experimentation, so it's not 100%. However, DDD, or dichlorodiphenyl dichloroethane, exceeded the MRL in milk and cheese in all 3 tested areas, so that's not great. Moderate amounts of DDT were also found in the dairy products. So while there were 7 toxicants studied, 4 of which were heavy metals, the pesticides were present in dangerous amounts. So the study concluded that there is moderate and increasing risk of nephrotoxicity, hepatotoxicity, hematotoxicity, cardiotoxicity, and reproductive issues after consumption of the dairy products from all 3 areas. So this could also be due to the heavy metals present. But as you can see on the graph on the right, there are also some dangerous amounts of these pesticides as well, above the recommended levels. So lastly, I kind of wanted to focus on imidacloprid, which I mentioned in 2 of these previous articles, and several articles that I've read for this presentation mentioned it. It's a very widely used insecticide. So yeah, so far I've discussed and referenced research that quantifies level of pesticide drift in environmental soil, sediments, and waters, along with studies that measure pesticide levels in animal tissues and animal products and the corresponding health effects. So that's kind of some general study in this area. But I was particularly interested in imidacloprid. So it was measured in Perez et al. In the environment and Hamamoto et al. In animal tissue. It is an insecticide that mimics nicotine, which is actually kind of common in insecticides. So it disrupts the arthropods' nervous system to kill them. I thought that was very interesting. Nicotine, like most drugs, actually evolved in plants to help them combat herbivores or anything that would promote its survival. So in this case, combats arthropods. So it's very widely used worldwide, especially in seed treatment, because bugs can get into seeds and eat them up. In another study I looked at, Fedrizzi et al. 2019, researchers measured the amounts of 5 different neonicotinoid pesticides in sheep and cow's milk, and this was collected from animals bred in the Jordan Valley, which lived next to like a citrus farm. They utilized these pesticides, and luckily in this study, They were not found in any harmful quantity, but that's just another study involving imidacloprid and high doses of the. And that's important because high doses can cause disruptions in growth. It causes some cholinergic effects and can even cause death, according to the USDA. So, pretty nasty potential chemical. But that's a look into pesticide drift, livestock health, and some particular pesticides and details on how all those work. So overall, this was a surprisingly understudied area of research. For as important a resource as livestock is worldwide, techniques and studies on their health regarding pesticide drift was not as abundant or really developed as I thought. A lot of techniques were kind of made during these studies, and a lot of these studies are that I looked at least are relatively new. So it's kind of it feels like an emerging study from all that I've looked at. It's an important field of study for agriculture, human health, and wider environmental toxicology. And hopefully, further study can help improve the health of people around the world. Here's some of my citations, and thank you all for listening.